In the hermetically sealed chambers of medieval Europe, where sulphurous vapors mingled with prayers whispered in dead languages, the alchemists spoke of a threshold that separated the dilettante from the adept. They called it the Nigredo, the blackening, and they described it in terms that seemed to defy reason: a descent into putrefaction, a voluntary drowning in darkness so complete that the mind itself threatened to dissolve. What these cryptic philosophers encoded in their recipes for metallic transformation was not, as the uninitiated supposed, a literal chemical operation, but rather a map of the soul's most harrowing passage. The Nigredo represents the first and most devastating stage of psychological death, the necessary dissolution of everything you believe yourself to be. And here lies the terrible paradox at the heart of the alchemical tradition. Only through the complete annihilation of the false self can the golden self, the integrated wholeness that Jung would later call the individuated personality, finally emerge from the ruins of your former life. The doctrine central to alchemical transformation rests upon a principle that runs counter to every instinct of self-preservation: that growth is not additive but subtractive, that wholeness is achieved not through accumulation but through radical dissolution. The medieval masters, working in the symbolic language necessitated by both church persecution and the ineffable nature of their actual work, described the prima materia, the raw substance requiring transformation, in deliberately contradictory terms. It was, they said, the most common thing, found everywhere and valued by no one, yet simultaneously the most precious substance in creation. This riddle pointed not to any mineral or metal, but to the human psyche itself in its unrealized state, simultaneously worthless in its current fragmented condition and infinitely valuable in its potential for integration. The alchemists understood what modern psychology has only recently begun to articulate: that the personality we construct in the first half of life, built from identifications with family, culture, and the demands of social survival, is necessarily partial, excluding vast territories of our potential being. This construct, which we mistake for our true self, must undergo systematic destruction before authentic selfhood can crystallize. The great work, the magnum opus that consumed the alchemist's entire existence, was encoded in the maxim solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. This was not a single operation, but a complete cycle of transformation, beginning always with dissolution. The Nigredo constitutes the solve phase in its most absolute form, the blackening that precedes all whitening, the death that precedes all rebirth, what the alchemists called putrefaction. The reduction of matter to its most base and formless state corresponds in psychological terms to the confrontation with everything the conscious mind has repressed, denied, or projected outward onto the world. Jung, drawing directly from the alchemical texts that obsessed him in his later years, recognized the Nigredo as the encounter with the shadow, not merely personal darkness, but the totality of unrealized possibility that consciousness has excluded in its desperate attempt to maintain a coherent identity. This is not the comfortable darkness of sleep, nor the productive darkness of rest, but rather the annihilating darkness of complete disorientation, where every structure of meaning threatens to collapse into meaninglessness. The descent into Nigredo does not announce itself with trumpets or clear demarcations. It begins, more often than not, with symptoms that the unprepared mind interprets as pathology, a creeping sense that the life you have built, with all its achievements and identifications, has become a prison of your own construction. The successful executive awakens one morning to find that the identity he has cultivated for decades feels like an elaborate costume he no longer remembers choosing to wear. The devoted mother discovers that the role she has performed with such dedication has devoured every other aspect of her being. The intellectual realizes that his carefully constructed worldview, built from approved sources and rational arguments, serves primarily to defend him against direct encounter with reality. These are the first whispers of the Nigredo, the initial stirrings of a process that, once begun in earnest, cannot be safely reversed or ignored. The alchemists warned in their obscure texts that once the vessel is sealed and the fire lit, premature opening would not only ruin the work, but potentially destroy the operator. They understood that certain thresholds, once crossed, transform the very ground from which return might be attempted. What compels a human being to voluntarily enter this darkness? The alchemists spoke of a divine discontent, a restlessness that could not be satisfied by any external acquisition or conventional success. Jung identified it as the call of the self, the totality of the psyche demanding its rightful sovereignty over the partial identifications of ego consciousness. In practical terms, the Nigredo often initiates through crisis, the loss that shatters your fundamental assumptions, the failure that undermines your most cherished self-image, the betrayal that reveals the fragility of the structures you believed permanent. But crisis alone does not constitute initiation. Countless individuals endure devastating losses and emerge with their unconsciousness intact, having learned only to build more elaborate defenses against future dissolution. The Nigredo proper begins when you recognize, with a clarity that borders on revelation, that the crisis is not an aberration to be overcome, but a summons to undergo fundamental transformation. This recognition requires a particular quality of attention, a willingness to remain present to your own dissolution, rather than immediately constructing explanations or seeking escape into new identifications. The phenomenology of the Nigredo, the actual lived experience of this stage, defies easy categorization precisely because it operates at the boundary of what consciousness can integrate and articulate. The alchemical texts describe the blackening in images of death, decay, and dismemberment. The Rosarium Philosophorum depicts the king and queen descending into a bath of dissolution, their bodies putrefying, their souls departing. This is not metaphorical exaggeration, but precise description of psychological experience. In the Nigredo, the structures that have organized your perception, the narratives that have given your life coherence, the values that have oriented your choices, all these begin to lose their compelling power. What remains is not the liberating emptiness promised by certain spiritual traditions, but rather a horrifying formlessness, a chaos that predates the order imposed by consciousness. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul, a phrase that has been so domesticated by popular usage that its original terror has been largely forgotten. St. John of the Cross, describing his own passage through this darkness, spoke of a night so complete that even faith itself becomes impossible, where the very capacity for meaning dissolves into what can only be experienced as abandonment by everything that once provided orientation. The Nigredo demands a quality of endurance that has no relationship to conventional resilience or positive thinking. The alchemist spoke of the slow fire, the gentle heat that must be maintained with unwavering consistency throughout the long months or years of the operation. Psychologically, this corresponds to the capacity to remain present to your own dissolution without either fleeing into distraction or accelerating the process through dramatic action. This is perhaps the most isolating aspect of the work, for the Nigredo cannot be shared in any meaningful way with those who have not entered it themselves. Your former companions, operating within the frameworks you have begun to dismantle, offer well-intentioned advice that no longer applies to your situation. They encourage you to return to normal, to regain your balance, to think positively, not recognizing that the very normalcy they celebrate is precisely what is being dissolved. The language available for discussing the experience proves inadequate, forcing you into either silence or the use of metaphors that sound, to uninitiated ears, like evidence of pathology or delusion. The alchemists worked in secrecy not merely to protect themselves from persecution, but because the work itself demanded a privacy that allowed the process to unfold without the interference of those who would prematurely interpret or attempt to rescue you from your necessary descent. Within the darkness of the Nigredo, a peculiar inversion begins to occur. What consciousness has always positioned as above and below reverses its polarity. The solar ego, that aspect of consciousness that has maintained order through systematic exclusion, must descend into the lunar realm of the unconscious. The alchemical imagery consistently depicts this reversal. The sun drowns in the sea. The king is devoured by the wolf. The gold is dissolved in aqua regia. These are not arbitrary symbols, but precise descriptions of a phenomenological reality. The organizing principles that have structured your conscious life, your sense of what is valuable and what is worthless, what is acceptable and what must be denied, all these undergo systematic dissolution. And here the work becomes truly dangerous. For without the familiar structures of meaning, consciousness itself threatens to fragment. The alchemists warned of the stage they called mortificatio, the death, where the operator could become lost in the darkness, trapped in depression or psychosis, unable to sustain the tension required for the work to proceed. This is not rhetorical warning, but recognition that the boundary between transformative dissolution and pathological disintegration is terrifyingly thin, maintained only by what the texts called the hermetic seal, the psychological container that allows the experience to be endured without total collapse. The temptation to retreat from the Nigredo is powerful and takes multiple forms, each apparently reasonable in its own terms. One common flight involves premature spiritual inflation, the leap into transcendent identifications that bypass the darkness rather than transforming it. The individual, unable to sustain the tension of dissolution, grasps at mystical experiences or spiritual teachings that seem to offer immediate escape from the darkness. But the alchemists were unequivocal on this point. There is no ascent without prior descent, no albedo without complete nigredo, no whitening without total blackening. The attempt to skip stages or accelerate the process produces not the philosopher's stone, but rather what they called the sophic sulfur, a brilliant but unstable substance that appears to be gold but lacks the permanence of the true metal. Psychologically, this manifests as the spiritual bypasser, the individual who employs transcendent language and practices to avoid rather than integrate their shadow material. Another temptation involves the construction of new identifications to replace those being dissolved. The mind, unable to tolerate the formlessness of the Nigredo, reaches desperately for new structures, new relationships, new careers, new ideologies, anything that might restore a sense of coherent identity. But these frantic constructions, built on unreconstructed foundations, inevitably collapse, returning consciousness to the darkness it attempted to escape. Yet within the apparent chaos of the Nigredo, a subtle ordering principle is at work, invisible to the consciousness undergoing dissolution, but evident in retrospect. The alchemists spoke of the secret fire, the inner heat that drives the transformation, distinct from the external fire of conscious will. Jung identified this with what he called the transcendent function, the self-organizing capacity of the psyche that operates beneath and beyond ego consciousness. This is not the directed intentionality of the conscious mind, but rather an autonomous process that consciousness can cooperate with but cannot control. The prima materia in its dissolution is not becoming nothing but rather returning to that state of undifferentiated potentiality from which new form can crystallize. The blackness of the Nigredo is not mere absence of light, but rather the darkness of the womb, of fertile void, of possibility not yet manifested. But this understanding typically comes only after the fact, for during the experience itself, consciousness perceives only annihilation. The alchemical texts describe a critical moment in the Nigredo when the blackening reaches its maximum intensity, a point they called the caput corvi, the raven's head, the absolute nadir of the descent. This corresponds to what we might call the 0 point of the old identity, the moment when everything that gave your life meaning has been so thoroughly dissolved that even the capacity for hope seems to have evaporated. And it is precisely here, at this point of maximum darkness, that the first intimations of transformation begin to manifest. The texts speak of the appearance of the peacock's tail, the cauda pavonis, a multiplicity of colors that emerges from the uniform blackness. Psychologically, this manifests as the first stirrings of a consciousness that is no longer identified with any single aspect of the psyche, but rather capable of witnessing the totality. This is not yet the integrated self, but it represents the first loosening of the total identification with ego consciousness that has characterized the entire previous existence. You begin to recognize, with a clarity that seems to arise from the dissolution itself, that what you have called I is not a unified entity, but rather a provisional coalition of forces, many of which have been operating entirely outside your awareness. The transition from Nigredo to albedo, from blackening to whitening, occurs not through willful effort, but through a kind of surrender that is simultaneously active and passive. The alchemists encoded this paradox in their injunction to feed the stone with its own blood, to nourish the work with its own substance. What this means in practical terms is that the consciousness emerging from the Nigredo must somehow remain present to its own dissolution without identifying with either the dissolving structures or the dissolution itself. You learn to observe the death of your cherished self-images with something approaching equanimity, not because you no longer care, but because you begin to recognize that what is dying was never truly alive in the first place. The identifications you have defended with such energy were always provisional constructions, necessary fictions that served their purpose in the first half of life, but have now become obstacles to further development. This recognition does not come as intellectual insight, but as embodied knowing, a shift in the very ground of being that cannot be adequately captured in language. What emerges from the successful completion of the Nigredo is not a return to the former state, now somehow improved or enhanced, but rather a fundamentally different organization of consciousness. The alchemists called this the albedo, the whitening, the purification that follows complete putrefaction. In Jungian terms, it represents the birth of the individuated self, the personality that has integrated rather than repressed its shadow material. This is not perfection, not the eradication of darkness or difficulty, but rather wholeness, the capacity to hold light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, in conscious relationship rather than unconscious opposition. The individual who has genuinely undergone the Nigredo and emerged into albedo possesses a quality the texts called the philosophical mercury, a fluid consciousness capable of moving between different levels of reality without losing its essential coherence. They no longer require the rigid defenses that characterize the unindividuated ego, for they have discovered through direct experience that consciousness can sustain contact with the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. The golden self that crystallizes from this process bears little resemblance to the ego ideal that consciousness typically constructs as its aspiration. It is not the perfected version of your current personality, with its rough edges smoothed and its deficiencies corrected. Rather, it represents what the alchemists called the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, a consciousness that has undergone complete death and reconstitution, that has descended into the darkness and returned bearing its treasures. This integrated self manifests certain characteristic qualities that distinguish it from both the unreconstructed ego and the inflated pseudo-transcendence of spiritual bypassing. First, there is a profound acceptance of limitation, not as resignation, but as recognition that finitude itself is the condition of authentic being. The individual who has genuinely undergone transformation no longer needs to defend against their human vulnerability, having discovered through the Nigredo that consciousness can sustain even its own dissolution. Second, there emerges a capacity for what the depth psychologists call holding the tension of opposites. The ability to remain present to contradiction without prematurely resolving it into false synthesis. This manifests practically as the ability to act decisively while remaining open to uncertainty, to commit fully while acknowledging the provisional nature of all commitments, to love deeply while accepting the ultimate separateness of all beings. The transformed individual relates to suffering in a fundamentally different way than consciousness operating from the unindividuated ego. Having undergone voluntary descent into the darkest regions of the psyche, having sustained contact with their own capacity for destruction and dissolution, they no longer require the elaborate defenses against pain that characterize normal consciousness. This is not masochism or glorification of suffering, but rather recognition that suffering, when engaged rather than avoided, serves as the primary agent of transformation. The alchemists spoke of the philosophical death as superior to natural death precisely because it was chosen, undertaken voluntarily rather than imposed by external circumstance. The individual who has survived the Nigredo knows, not as abstract principle but as lived reality, that consciousness can endure far more than the protective ego believes possible. This knowledge manifests not as hardness or imperviousness to pain, but rather as a kind of flexible strength, the capacity to bend without breaking, to dissolve without disintegrating. Yet we must be scrupulously honest about the cost of this transformation. The alchemical texts consistently warn that the work is not for everyone, that many are called but few complete the operation. Those who genuinely undergo the Nigredo and emerge transformed often find themselves in a peculiar relationship to the collective. Having dismantled the conventional structures of meaning through which most people organize their experience, they can no longer fully participate in the consensual reality that these structures maintain. This is not superiority, but simple incompatibility. The concerns that occupy normal consciousness, the anxieties and aspirations that drive conventional success, appear from the perspective of the transformed individual as elaborate defenses against the very encounter with reality that the work demands. This can produce a profound isolation, not the melodramatic alienation of the misunderstood genius, but rather the quiet solitude of the person who has visited territories that cannot be adequately communicated to those who have not themselves made the journey. The golden self that emerges from the alchemical crucible bears responsibility that the unindividuated ego need never confront. Having integrated rather than repressed the shadow, having made conscious the unconscious forces that drive behavior, the individual can no longer claim the innocence of ignorance. The alchemists spoke of the weight of the stone, its specific gravity that exceeded all other substances, pointing to the gravity in the ethical sense that accompanies genuine transformation. You become accountable not merely for your actions, but for your very being, recognizing that consciousness itself carries moral weight. This is not the conventional morality of following external rules, but rather what Nietzsche called the morality of the noble, the self-legislation that arises from integration rather than repression. The transformed individual must create their own values, not arbitrarily, but in response to the demands of their particular configuration of being. This is simultaneously liberation and burden, for it removes the comfort of appealing to external authority while demanding that you live with full awareness of the consequences of your choices. The practical manifestation of this transformation often appears paradoxical to observers. The individual who has undergone genuine alchemical work may appear simultaneously more grounded and more detached, more engaged with immediate reality, and less invested in conventional outcomes. They participate fully in the world while maintaining what the texts called the philosophical distance, the capacity to observe even their own participation without complete identification. This double consciousness, the ability to be both within and outside experience simultaneously, represents one of the primary achievements of the work. It corresponds to what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold conscious and unconscious, ego and self, in productive tension rather than rigid opposition. This manifests practically as the ability to act decisively without attachment to outcome, to commit fully while maintaining awareness of the provisional nature of all commitments, to love deeply while recognizing the ultimate separateness of all beings. The alchemical tradition consistently emphasizes that the great work is never truly complete, that the stone itself, once achieved, must be continually renewed through ongoing operation. This points to a crucial understanding. Transformation is not a destination, but a continuous process, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. The individual who has undergone the Nigredo and achieved initial integration discovers that consciousness itself continuously generates new material for integration, that the shadow continuously reconstellates in new forms, that the work demands constant attention and renewal. But this ongoing demand no longer appears as burden, but rather as the very substance of life itself. Having discovered through direct experience that meaning emerges not from achieving security or stability, but from engaging the perpetual transformation at the heart of existence. The transformed individual embraces rather than resists the flux that terrifies normal consciousness. The gift that the transformed individual offers to the collective is not primarily their actions, however valuable these may be, but rather their very being. By undertaking the work of conscious integration, by refusing the comfort of unconsciousness, they contribute to what Jung called the lightening of the darkness of the collective unconscious. This is not mystical speculation, but recognition that consciousness is not individual in any absolute sense, that the work you do on your own psyche has ripple effects throughout the interconnected field of human awareness. The alchemists understood this, encoding it in their maxim that the work performed in the laboratory simultaneously transformed the operator and contributed to the redemption of matter itself. Every individual who refuses the temptation to remain unconscious, who voluntarily undergoes the dissolution required for genuine transformation, makes it fractionally easier for others to undertake the same work. This is not because they provide a method or teaching, but rather because consciousness itself is collective, and genuine transformation in any individual consciousness creates openings in the collective that were not previously available. In the closing years of your life, should you survive to look back upon your passage through the Nigredo, you may recognize it as the axis around which everything else revolved, the descent that made ascent possible, the death that enabled authentic life. The golden self that emerged from those flames bears little resemblance to what you imagined yourself becoming in your youth, when transformation seemed to mean the perfection of your existing qualities rather than their complete reconstitution. You discovered, as every genuine alchemist discovers, that the gold you sought was not found through addition, but through subtraction, not through becoming more, but through becoming less, not through strengthening the ego, but through allowing its dissolution. And in that dissolution, in that moment when everything you believed yourself to be threatened to evaporate into nothingness, you found what the texts always promised, that consciousness itself, stripped of all identification, reveals itself as the philosopher's stone, the substance that transforms whatever it touches, not through its power, but through its very being. The treasure you seek is not hidden in cryptic manuscripts or guarded by mystical orders, but buried in the rejected soil of your own unlived life, waiting to be discovered by the one person with courage enough to descend into the darkness and remain there until the gold precipitates from the dissolved matter of your former self.